Finally. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces. You know, we all are, and all of your patients are subjected to at least low-level exposures to environmental toxicants on a daily or intermittent basis. And there's a lot of nonsense out there on the internet and on TV about detoxification. We got Dr. Wu's magic 6-day cleanse, which will cure all that ails you. But we know better than that. And we have incredible, inducible, endogenous detoxification systems that should be optimized either as a standalone protocol or, very importantly, as an integral component of any metal decorporation. The chelators only work in the extracellular space, and you can chelate until the cows come home. If you don't bolster the cell's ability to push the metals out, the chelation gives you much less bang for their buck. And that's my bottom line message here. So what I'm going to do this morning is talk about some of the key components of this wonderful innate detoxification processes that we have, emphasizing the scientific rationale for appropriate lab tests towards individualized patient support. And individualized is a key factor. So, clear disclosure, I am employed at Doctor's Data, and I don't make stuff up. All my stuff comes from sound studies in the literature. So what I'm going to cover is excessive oxidative stress. I'm going to talk about reactive oxygen species, the causes, their consequences, how we assess them, how we can ameliorate them. We're going to talk about quintessential glutathione. We're going to talk about detoxification of chemical entities, because metals and chemicals compete for similar processes for detoxification, and the metals can really mess up chemical detoxification. And then an essential component of detoxification and health in general is methionine metabolism, often referred to as methylation, but it's really methylation, transsulfuration, and transmethylation. And intertwined throughout my lecture, you will see where the villainous gang of four, as I call them, the most commonly encountered toxic metals, come into play. So I always like to quote government agencies, because if any of your naysayers from down the street get into a discussion with you, if you come out with statements from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences or the CDC, regardless of how you feel about the CDC, it's hard for them to argue with you. And some of my favorites are that from the NIEHS is that the knowledge of adverse effects of toxicants have been studied primarily independently. And that's not the real world. We're exposed to a soup of toxins. And the problem with that is that we know that toxicants, both metals and chemicals, can elicit independent, additive, and even synergistic toxic effects. Again, this comes from the CDC. And very important, because you're treating individuals and not populations. Individuals vary considerably in their sensitivity to toxicants, and susceptibility to the toxic effects vary with age, gender, pregnancy status, nutritional status, total toxic load, and genetics. And people are going to be talking about these single nucleotide polymorphisms later in the day. Now, one of my favorite quotes from the CDC is actually quite old now. It's about 8 years old. Is that the epidemic of epidemics of cardiovascular, immunological, and neurological diseases is likely associated with environmental toxins. This is from the CDC. And I think it's clear from the literature now that we can also include cancer in this list of 3. So I'm really going to focus on oxidative stress early on, because one of the primary effects of these toxicants is, in fact, oxidative stress. which has been clearly shown to be associated with a plethora of serious sustained or chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, stroke, cancer, hypertension, immune dysregulation, serious neurological diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Huntington's, rheumatoid arthritis, mitochondrial dysfunction, chronic hepatitis, hyperglycemia, and diabetic nephropathy and retinopathy, pancreatitis, and even cystic fibrosis. So what are some of the causes or sources of excessive oxidative stress? Remember, reactive oxygen species are important. They're critical for life. They're important messengers in a cell to turn things on to protect us. They're even deployed by our immune system to kill infectious invaders. But when we have an excess of oxidative stress, we have problems. And this can be caused by one major factor, lifestyle choices, things like smoking, excessive alcohol, illicit drug use, diet, and excessive exercise. Not just good, healthy stress exercise, but excessive exercise, particularly in extreme heat. And when we talk about diet, we think about insufficient intake of antioxidative nutrients. Of course, we have excessive exposure to environmental toxicants, including the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Also, often neglected is excess retention of essential transition metals like iron, copper, and cobalt. You think, well, where are people getting cobalt? How many of you have patients with metal on metal hips? Every one of those patients has excessive levels of cobalt in their body, as well as trivalent chromium. We also have a real problem when we have, oxidative stress causes impaired biotransformation reactions. That's phase 1, 2, and 3. We have problems with ionizing radiation, both outdoors and indoors. Indoors with radon and ozone. Remember those wonderful laser printers, as opposed to the dot matrix printers, they are cranking out the ozone. And the biggest problem occurs when we have an overwhelmed or impaired cellular and plasma redox systems. And we can detect the imbalance and the malfunction of these redox systems looking at RBC, glutathione, or my favorite is the ratio of oxidized to reduced cysteine. That is like the most sensitive indicator of circulating redox capacity. So let's take a look at the effect of metals on generating reactive oxygen species. First, we have the transition metals, iron, copper, which are essential for life, but also cobalt and nickel. These invoke the inductions of reactive oxygen species such as the superoxide dismutase, or superoxide anion rather, as well as the dreadful hydroxy radical. And it's estimated that we form naturally about 4 million hydroxy radicals per day. So we have a big job of trying to quench these things. Then we move over to the gang of 4, cadmium, arsenic, lead, mercury, and I will now add to that thallium and gadolinium, so the gang of 6. These elements are conjugated to glutathione as part of our natural mechanisms for getting them out of the cell and out of the body. And so by either the transition elements or the gang of 6, I will call them now, what happens is we stress our glutathione system. When we get decreased glutathione, we get oxidized macromolecules such as DNA, lipids, proteins. An example would be oxidized ApoB in LDL. That's where we get our oxidized LDL. We get endothelial dysfunction and vascular and neuroinflammation. Now, the most important radical reactive oxygen species is the hydroxyl radical. And numerous toxicologists have stated that it's the most important oxygen radical, particularly causing damage to molecules like DNA. And the amazing thing about the hydroxyl radical is that it has a half-life of 1/1,000,000th of a second. It is so reactive. It's an equal opportunity offender. It attacks the nearest thing available. It's depleted of an electron, so it will grab an electron from anything that it can. So it's extremely dangerous to the organism, and very, very importantly, unlike most of the other reactive oxygen species, it cannot be eliminated by an innate enzyme process or enzymatic reaction. So we have formation of the hydroxy radical through the Fenton reaction, where we take ferrous iron and react with quenchable hydrogen peroxide and form the hydroxide ion. And then in red there is the, the hydroxy radical. And then in the Haber-Weiss reaction, you remember this from chemistry, right? We have the quenchable superoxide ion and hydrogen peroxide, which is a non-radical quenchable reactive oxygen species, again forming the hydroxy radical. Now, quenching is very important, and it requires key obligatory element cofactors for the reactions. For example, the superoxide ion can be quenched by the enzyme superoxide dismutase, converting it to non-radical hydrogen peroxide. That requires copper and zinc in the cytosol, and manganese, not magnesium, in the mitochondria. Then we have also catalase that converts the hydrogen peroxide that's formed using heme iron to produce water. So that's great. We can get rid of the hydrogen peroxide also by glutathione peroxidase. But in that process, which requires selenium, another essential element, we gobble up 2 entire tripeptides of glutathione. But thank goodness we have an enzyme called glutathione reductase that requires magnesium that reduces the oxidized glutathione back to 2 molecules of glutathione. But that is a very high energy demanding process, requiring about 10% of our total glucose disposal per day, and that's via the hexose monophosphate shunt. Now, I showed you some key obligatory essential element cofactors, and the question is, how do we assess those? How do we assess the status in the patients? I had an opportunity, I had a clinician who only did hair testing, and kept every year the patient would come in for annual checkup and they would do a hair test, not being my first choice. Anyhow, she said this patient always has very high hair magnesium, and she doesn't take magnesium. What's going on? Well, I knew what was going on here, especially after I found out that the patient was a vegan, and that relates to taurine. So I said I wanted for this to be a teaching moment, and so I asked her to take this patient that had the high hair magnesium and do a whole blood elements and a red blood cell element test. Okay, so this was an experiment. This wasn't at the patient's expense. So you can see in the whole blood that despite her high hair magnesium, her magnesium was perfectly normal, right in the center of the reference range. The zinc was also within the normal limits, but you'll notice the high selenium and the arsenic, and we'll talk more about that. So everything looked fine, quite different from hair. And then when we look at the red blood cell elements that were drawn at the very same time, looking at the intracellularly functioning elements, we saw her magnesium was actually very low, 1 point above the 2.5th percentile, as was zinc. So the take-home message is here is if you're looking for the function of intracellular elements, use a surrogate cell marker. Don't just look in serum or even whole blood. Now, you might think that this patient has too much selenium, but there's a problem with selenium wasting to bind the sulfhydroreactive metals such as arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. And we frequently see this when you see elevated selenium, or say arsenic or mercury. And that's not an indication of overabundance of selenium. That's wasting selenium away from its important biological function, which would be what? Glutathione peroxidase. Okay? So that could be easily misinterpreted. So back to the hydroxy radical and the oxidative damage to DNA. The 2-deoxyguanosine nucleoside base is extremely vulnerable to attack by this vicious hydroxyl radical, and that forms a product called 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine. We'll just call it 8-hydroxy-DG. And 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we have endonucleases that remove the oxidized guanosine nucleoside base and replace it with a virgin guanosine. Yes, there are still some virgins left on the planet. Now, that cleaved 8-hydroxy-DG is almost quantitatively cleaved and excreted in the urine. So the 8-hydroxy-DG is considered to be the predominant biomarker of the total oxidative damage to DNA by radical reactive oxygen species, and levels in first morning urine voids correlate very well with a 24-hour, very inconvenient urine collection. The correlation is very high. So 8-hydroxy-DG can be measured in urine as an indicator of deep intracellular oxidative damage. There's all kinds of ways to look at oxidative stress, oxidized lipids. You can look at SOD activity, but those are quenchable. This guy is not quenchable. The hydroxy radical, you can't be measured directly, but we can look at a final product of its effect on a deep intracellular molecule, very important, DNA. So we can measure it in the urine, but is what we're measuring in the urine really reflective of what's going on in a cell? Absolutely. 8-hydroxy-DG in the urine is in fact indicative of intracellular levels, and this was documented in a human study where they measured the 8-hydroxy-DG in extracted lymphocytes and urine from the same patients, measured the 8-hydroxy-DG by 3 independent ways of measuring it, and in fact the 8-hydroxy-DG in the lymphocytes and the urine were extremely highly correlated by all 3 methods. So highly sensitive and specific immunoassays are used extensively in clinical trials as well as by diagnostic laboratories. And the beauty of this test is if your patient can pee in a cup, they can do this test, okay? Now, there's several ways in which 8-hydroxy-DG can be associated with cancer. It can cause single and double strand breaks, cross-linking, but most research interest involves the nucleoside base oxidation. In the last 10 years, there's been 6,500 papers on 8-hydroxy-DG, and no, I haven't read them all yet. The 8-hydroxy-DG is a radical in and of itself, okay? It gets radicalized by the hydroxyl radical. That initiates and promotes carcinogenesis and induces a cytidine to thymidine transversion, which is among the most frequent somatic mutation found in human cancers, that is epigenetic. And 8-hydroxy-DG has been shown to have a major role in spontaneous mutagenesis in rodent models. So some of the cancers associated with elevated 8-hydroxy-DG in urine include colorectal, hepatocarcinogenesis, oral squamous cell carcinoma, breast, ovarian, that is adjusted for oral contraceptives, prostate and bladder cancer, and a lot of research on 8-hydroxy-DG with lung cancer, specific studies related to tobacco smoke, diesel exhaust particles that contain metals, and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, oil fly ash, which contains vanadium, manganese, nickel, and lead, which are all components of air pollution. Now, I have actually seen 2 cases that look like this. The reference value is about 8.2. And I've had 2 cases of females with levels as up in the 70s, so over 10 times higher. And in both cases, one case was a woman actually had breast cancer, the other case had ovarian cancer. So it's an excellent marker of cancer in addition to just major oxidative stress. So 8-hydroxy-DG has other pathogenic roles. It causes mitochondrial dysfunction, general cytotoxicity, inflammation throughout the body, global ischemia, particularly after a myocardial infarction. As I said, it's associated with type 2 diabetes, nephropathy, and retinopathy. And the 8-hydroxy-DG is highly correlated with hemoglobin A1C, and that is also associated with endothelial dysfunction in pre-diabetics. Cardiovascular disease, a significant factor. One of my favorite subjects. I was a senior cardiovascular pharmacologist in a previous life before I jumped the fence and came to see you people. So I am a reformed pharmacologist. Okay. So 8-hydroxy-DG is a predictor, is turning out to be a decent predictor of cardiac events. It's a very sensitive biomarker of oxidative damage to cardiac tissue mitochondrial DNA. So not just the nucleus. And remember, the nucleus and the mitochondrial DNA are different, but 8-hydroxy-DG is formed from both subcellular organelles. And elevated urinary 8-hydroxy-DG was highly correlated with clinical status and cardiac dysfunction. In fact, in a prospective study of 186 patients, they were studied for almost 2 years, 1.8 years. What they found was that after the 1.8 years, the individuals that had the elevated 8-hydroxy, which they used the cutoff of 12.4, had 4 times the hazard ratio for an actual cardiac event. Also, very importantly, elevated levels of 8-hydroxy-DG have been isolated from atherosclerotic plaques from humans. So a significant factor even with cardiovascular disease as well as cancer. Now, we can also pick up elevated oxidative damage to the subcellular organelles associated with environmental air pollution. And this was a fascinating study out of China in which they looked at school children from 2 different schools. One school was directly adjacent to and downwind of 8 coal-fired power plants, which have some pretty nasty effluents. And school B was upwind in a suburban area. And as you can see, the children that were in school A here had about double the levels of urine arsenic and more than double the levels of the marker of oxidative damage to DNA. So even with environmental exposure. Now, in that study, these were children, and it's important when you're using a laboratory measuring 8-hydroxy-DG in urine that you use the appropriate reference ranges. Because a study of 100 adults and 157 children clearly showed that the highest levels, and these were healthy children, occurred in neonates and then through young years and plateaued during adolescence and with adults. So you really have to apply the laboratory has to apply the appropriate reference ranges If you have a 4-year-old child that comes in at 17 and you're using an adult cutoff value, you're going to freak out, and it's not appropriate. So laboratories always have to use age and sex-related reference values. Now, the people that wrote this article suggested that maybe this difference was really related to the high rate of growth and replication of DNA during the younger years, but I would argue that it's simply expressed per gram creatinine, and the creatinine's much lower in the younger children. So this is adjusted for creatinine, so naturally the levels are going to be higher in young kids. There may be a factor of growth, but that couldn't be teased out in this study. Bottom line is, use age-appropriate reference values. Now, this is an interesting study that showed a correlation between the levels of urine 8-hydroxy-DG DNA damage correlated with urine mercury, unprovoked mercury. And it's not hard to get a good correlation when you have civilians walking around that aren't exposed to high levels of mercury, and then you include those that are occupationally exposed. So remember, in Statistics 101, you get a correlation coefficient here of 0.6, which was highly statistically significant. But what do you do to explain the variability in Y 8-hydroxy associated with the variable levels of mercury? You square that correlation coefficient, which will round it to 0.6, which becomes 0.36. So 36% of the variability in the 8-hydroxy is in fact directly related to the level of mercury. So that leaves a whole lot of other explanations. 36% doesn't explain, 2/3 of the variability in the 8-hydroxy. So remember, antioxidant status and other toxicants are involved. So there's clearly a relationship with urine mercury, but it's not the only part of the picture. So what you've all been waiting for is clinical intervention to decrease the levels of 8-hydroxy-DG. First rule of toxicology is what? Remove the source of exposure. Probably the most difficult part of what you do. All the time I can do in consultations with docs, and they say, well, what's causing this? I'm 900 miles away. You get the patient in front of you. You do the patient history, and you know about the patient. You know about their house. You know about their water. You know if they live next to a strawberry field, okay? I can't tell you that. I can only tell you what the number is, okay? So in the literature, there's very inconsistent results when they tried to look at an effect of individual nutrients on reducing damaged DNA. And there were very inconsistent results for vitamin C alone, carotenes, synthetic vitamin E, no surprise there, or lycopene. However, one study approached reality. Unfortunately, it was only 14 days long. And what they found was that there was a trend for decreased 8-hydroxy-DG in urine in human subjects who were consuming 12 servings of fruits and vegetables, lots of color, versus about 6 servings, and that was only 14 days. I'm very confident that had they gone for a realistic period of time, that this would have become statistically significant. So we can quench the superoxide ion, we can quench hydrogen peroxide, we can't quench directly the hydroxy radical, but glutathione is very, very important for maintaining the redox state of the proteins necessary for protection and repair of that DNA. Now, we all familiar, if you're not familiar by now, you're going to be, that oral encapsulated powdered glutathione is useless systemically. It's great if you want to provide protection to the gastrointestinal enterocytes, but they hog it on and use it. And this was a very definitive random double-blind placebo-controlled study of 40 adults that had acute or chronic illnesses. And for 4 weeks, half of the subjects got 500 milligrams of the powdered oral glutathione, spelled wrong, twice a day. So 1,000 milligrams twice a day versus a placebo. Typically, pectin's used as a placebo. There was absolutely no effect of the powdered glutathione on the level of 8-hydroxy-DG in urine or the levels of F2 isoprostane, which is just an indicator of lipid oxidation. There was no change in total red blood cell glutathione or the ratio of oxidized to reduced glutathione in plasma, a very sensitive marker of oxidative stress. So what I'd like for you to consider is oral liposomal glutathione as a jump start while trying to increase glutathione biosynthesis. And the liposomal glutathione is one of my favorite recent inventions or applications of liposomes. During my graduate study in lipid biochemistry, I played with liposomes a lot, and they're really, really cool. These little spheres, and in this case of a bilayer of phospholipids, you can see the blue phospholipid charged head groups, which make the particle soluble. And then in the core, we have an encapsulated water phase. Now that water phase contains the glutathione, and that facilitates absorption. Now, I did a lot of studies with liposomes in animals, in rodent models, but here I finally got, 40 years later, got to do a study in humans. And this was a pilot study of a 57-year-old female, 14 years Lyme's disease, moderate lead and cadmium. We did a baseline glutathione on 2 different occasions. She was about 73% of the lower end of the reference value. And then after taking only 1 teaspoon of oral liposomal glutathione once a day, 2 hours away from food, we found that after 2 weeks it was elevated. The RBC glutathione was increased 26%, and by 4 months it was well up into the normal reference range at 128%. And we were careful to measure the RBC glutathione 24 hours after the last dose, so we weren't just measuring liposomes stuck to the RBCs. So we can increase, that's a good jump start. Liposomal glutathione is not inexpensive. My approach, my thinking is that what we want to do is help the body do what it can do. And that is to increase glutathione biosynthesis, providing adequate dietary, high biological value dietary protein. You can use methionine as long as you use the appropriate cofactors. N-acetylcysteine is a safer choice. And I hate to say this at AAEM because I've been anti-milk for so many years, but a medicinal whey protein, not casein, but whey protein. Antioxidants, real mixed tocopherols, E, C, alpha-lipoic acid, curcumin, all generate and help spare glutathione, and then the vitamins and magnesium listed. So that's providing the rate-limiting amino acid. But we also want to upregulate the rate-limiting enzyme in glutathione biosynthesis, which is gamma-glutamylcysteine ligase. We can do that by using curcumin, quercetin, oleanolic acid, or sulforaphane, which all increase the induction of the GCL gene expression. So a two-pronged approach, increasing the rate-limiting amino acid and upregulating the rate-limiting machinery to make glutathione. So just, I'm a very visual person to highlight. We want to provide the rate-limiting amino acid, adequate magnesium and potassium, and upregulate the rate-limiting enzyme, and we can do that with curcumin, quercetin, or oleanolic acid. But remember that curcumin has extremely low oral bioavailability. If you want to work on inflammation in the gut, curcumin's great. But the problem is curcumin gets glucuronidated in the gut, and that inhibits its absorption. So what you want to use is a curcumin that has the black pepper extract, because that markedly increases the bioavailability, as well as consume it with a meal, particularly because the curcuminoids are fat soluble and you want to have fat in the diet to enhance the absorption. Now, glutathione is very much related to the oxidative stress invoked by these metals and chemicals and associated with cardiovascular disease. We know that serum reduced glutathione levels are inversely correlated with arterial intimal medial thickness in humans. The oxidative stress causes oxidized LDL, unregulated uptake of oxidized LDL by macrophages in the lesions, and oxidative damage to the macrophages, which can in turn oxidize normal and particularly small dense LDL. Now, rats don't get atherosclerosis. I've tried many times. They just don't get it. Okay? So you have to use an ApoE null mouse or rat model. And in the ApoE null rat model, oral liposomal glutathione decreased oxidized LDL, oxidized macrophages, and most importantly, aortic lesion area by up to 30%. So oral liposomal glutathione is way more powerful than just powdered encapsulated glutathione. So here we have a fairly recent discovery that in fact HDL and LDL circulate not only with glutathione, but with glutathione peroxidase. So it has built-in antioxidants circulating with it, but also very importantly, PON1, peroxidase 1, which is not only critical for getting rid of organophosphorus compounds, but it's also a very important antioxidant. Now, here's just to kind of sum it up, is the glutathione status and oxidative stress. A 59-year-old male, heavy smoker, elevated blood pressure, and high blood levels of lead and cadmium. This is a train wreck waiting to happen, or I should say an MI waiting to happen. You can see his RBC glutathione was about 65% normal. His 8-hydroxy-DG, his oxidative stress marker, was significantly elevated, as was his oxidized LDL. Yes?
Would it run with the 8-hydroxy?
I think in the studies that I've read that the 8-hydroxy and the HSCRP are highly correlated, yes. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
What labs accurately measure the 8-hydroxy?
I am not allowed to discuss that. I think there's other people that can.
And yeah, I was headed toward up front to ask you. Also, when you talk about 12 servings of fruits and vegetables, is that per day?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Lots of color, berries. You know, as one of my least favorite mentors or professors in grad school said, she used to say, she was a Southern lady, and she used to say, if your plate looks pretty, it's nutritious. And there's a lot of truth to that. The more color on your plate, the better.
I have a question. Have you used, or do you know of the use of acetyl glutathione?
I've seen studies about acetyl glutathione. I haven't seen a head-to-head comparison with the liposomal, but it certainly definitely looks better than just the non-acetylated glutathione. Yes, sir.
I think you could answer this one. When is it appropriate to use, let's say, oral NAC versus a glutathione?
Well, like I said, the liposomal glutathione, or maybe the N-acetyl glutathione, would be direct input of glutathione. The problem is that cells don't take up glutathione. They break it down by peptidases, take up the corresponding 3 amino acids, and rebuild it. So that's why I like the approach of giving the rate-limiting amino acids and upregulating the machinery to increase glutathione biosynthesis. It certainly doesn't hurt to give liposomal glutathione or N-acetyl glutathione, but ultimately we also want to upregulate the machinery, the enzyme that makes glutathione. Again, we want to help the body help itself. Okay.
Dr. Quig, would a low urinary level of N-acetylcysteine imply a skewed ratio between cysteine and cysteine?
Not necessarily. In fact, we're going to get to what urinary N-acetylcysteine conjugated compounds mean, but no. And it's something that laboratories haven't been able to do yet, because measuring oxidized versus reduced cysteine in plasma, once you pull it out of the body, it oxidizes so fast. So unless you're doing a -80 freeze and shipping it on dry ice, which is not fun, that's something that I've long been looking for a preservative, because I think that is the most excellent marker of the redox status. What I want to talk about is the tremendous influence of the gastrointestinal metabolome on toxicology. Now, Dr. Jeremy Nicholson, who you may know as the granddaddy of the metabolomics of the entire body, has stated rather obviously that gastrointestinal microbial status affects the outcomes of exposures to environmental and food contaminants. And speaking with a very prominent toxicologist from one of the Ivy League universities, he kind of whispered to me at a meeting that the toxicokinetic models that we use really need to be revised to include the gut, because the gut has a tremendous influence on what happens not only in the gut but in the liver and systemically. Now, when we talk about the influence of the gastrointestinal metabolome, we first think about pre-systemic detoxification, things like arsenic and chemical entities. And one of my favorite examples of a pre-systemic effect of the metabolome is the conversion by the microbes of a phytoestrogen precursor from hops, yay beer, to an anti-inflammatory cardioprotective compound. But on the other side of the coin, we can have pre-systemic exacerbation of toxicants by the gastrointestinal microbes. And the terrible example there was in China, where they added melamine to diluted milk to increase the apparent nitrogen content. And what happened was that the bacterium Klebsiella pteryngina converted the melamine to cyanuric acid that exacerbated the melamine-induced nephrotoxicity in hundreds of thousands of children. So the gut can have a beneficial or a detrimental effect on conversion of toxicants. Now, and we also look systemically. The gut can influence biotransformation reactions that occur both in the intestinal wall as well as in the liver. Some gut metabolites can inhibit the cytochrome P450 enzymes, as well as phase 3 detoxification, particularly through inflammation, and I'll talk more about that. Now, on the other hand, toxicants can directly disrupt the gastrointestinal microbiome and metabolome, and thereby affect toxicokinetics and pharmacokinetics. That's very important to the pharmaceutical companies now, trying to explain why different doses of drugs are required to get the same effects, and why some drugs cause more serious side effects because of the oral drugs, because of what's happening in their particular microbiome. But the bottom line is that, contrary to what we've always been told, the liver is the metabolic warehouse of the body. There's absolutely a lot of truth to that. But the fact of the matter is, the metabolic activity of the gastrointestinal microbiome not only rivals, but also affects what goes on in the liver. So, not to insult your intelligence, I know you're all familiar with this. We're going to talk about phases 1, 2, and 3. the oxidative activation, conjugation, and then the unidirectional excretion of the conjugated phase 2 products via ATP-dependent efflux pumps. Now, the take-home message here is that optimal detoxification requires coordinated regulation of genes encoding for all enzymes in all 3 phases. We don't just fix phase 2 without working on phase 1 or phase 3. Now, phase 1, of course, is oxidative activation, adding reactive polar groups, requires prosthetic heme, which is absolutely essential for the CYP activity. And heme biosynthesis, you'll recall the porphyrinogen pathway requires iron and zinc. And abnormal porphyrin profiles in the urine can be affected by anemias and inherited enzyme defects. And for many, many years now, well documented in the literature, is our very specific porphyrin fingerprints, if you will, associated with different metals, such as mercury, lead, arsenic, and chemical entities. So you can look at a first morning urine void for abnormal porphyrin metabolism patterns to detect a physiological impact of an environmental toxicant. So what we have here is phase 1, where we activate the hydrophobic, typically xenobiotic, to an activated xenobiotic, but we have a problem here. The big 4, as well as cobalt and hexavalent chromium, as well as gadolinium, all inhibit the cytochrome P450 activity, as does the active components of glyphosate. But also from the gut, we have the lipopolysaccharide, or otherwise known as the O antigen, that's from gram-negative bacteria that also impairs cytochrome P450 activity. Now, the O antigen can also induce pro-inflammatory cytokine release from macrophages and epithelial cells throughout the body, and that's through NF-kappa B pro-inflammatory signaling. So phase 2 is conjugation of that more toxic toxin from phase 1, and that requires things like glucuronidation and sulfation. And very importantly, remember that phase 2 conjugates cannot cross lipid membranes at a sufficient rate without the specific ATP-dependent exporters. That's phase 3. So they're not soluble enough to get out of the cell very well on their own. So here we have phase 2. We have the activated, more toxic toxin, in this case being conjugated to glutathione, glutathione S-transferase. My colleagues are going to talk about SNPs in GST later on. But again, we have these nasty metals coming in and inhibiting the glutathione conjugation. And when that happens, we back up phase 2 and phase 1, and we get an excessive amount of these active electrophiles and reactive oxygen species. Now, without getting too gory in the biochemistry, I want to go through the rest of phase 2 because typically we just talk about, okay, you conjugate it and that's it. Actually, you have the glutathione S conjugate to the activated xenobiotic. And then through a series of proteolytic activities, we get rid of the glutamate and the glycine, and we're left with a cysteine S conjugate of the activated xenobiotic. That is finally N-acetylated. That's where your N-acetylcysteine would come in. And then you have the product mercapturic acids that are the final products excreted in the urine and the bile of phase 2 detoxification that entails glutathione conjugation. And again, the mercapturic acids get into the urine and feces via the phase 3 efflux pumps. So phase 3, as Arnold Schwarzenegger will say, that is the pump it out baby phase. And it entails these membrane-bound efflux pumps that decrease the intracellular levels of the phase 2 conjugates They're extremely energy dependent. They entail the multi-resistant, multi-drug resistant associated proteins and the OAT proteins, organic ion transport proteins, not to be confused with organic acids. And they are concentrated in the kidney proximal tubule membranes, and in the hepatocyte cannulicular membranes, they pump the conjugated toxins upstream, that's where your energy comes in, into the bile for final excretion into the intestines, which is why we need to keep the bowels moving. We're dumping this stuff in the intestines, we don't want it to be taken back up. So I show this cartoon. I love cartoons of biochemistry. I'm kind of a nerd, but this just shows that the lipopolysaccharide O antigen actually activates the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. The LPS binds to the toll-like 4 pattern recognition receptors, and through help of adapter molecules actually turns on the transcription factor NF-kappa B that induces the production of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and this occurs not only on the macrophages in the gut and dendritic cells in the lamina propria, but also in epithelial cells, including the arterial wall. So this can result in inflammation in the gut, gastritis. You can would be associated with arthritis, asthma, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and even neuroinflammation, which is a huge issue. So gastrointestinal inflammation impairs the hepatic detoxification. Intestinal inflammation downregulates these hepatic efflux pumps, phase 3. And when you back up phase 3, you back up phase 1 and 2, which increases oxidative stress. To check for inflammation in the gut, you can look at, those of you who do comprehensive stool analysis, you can look at the inflammatory protein markers, calprotectin, lactoferrin, lysozyme in stool. Look for dysbiotic gram-negative bacteria, which are abundant in the lipopolysaccharides. O antigen, the status of probiotic bacteria, butyrate, which I'll talk about tomorrow afternoon, is tremendously helpful as an anti-inflammatory. Vitamin D, absolutely essential, dampens pro-inflammatory cytokine responses. Do check your patient's vitamin D levels. And secretory IgA abrogates that NF-kappa B pro-inflammatory signaling, and that's shown to be very effective with the probiotic Saccharomyces boulardii and the most heavily studied probiotic Lactobacillus rhamnos GG, as well as Bifidobacterium lactis BB12. And I'm sure there's others, but again, I like to show things for which there is published data. Okay, my arrow's in the wrong place. So we can assess the status of phase 1 and phase 2 by a very simple urine test. And this is a case of a 48-year-old female who became ill after starting work in a brand new energy efficient office complex. And as you know, these high energy efficient sealed buildings, off-gassing carpet and furniture chemicals, there's typically the levels of volatile organic carbons are about 10 times higher indoors than outdoors. And here we're looking at the D-glucaric acid as an indicator of phase 1 being turned on, because with co-induction of the cytochrome P450s, we get induction of the glucuronic acid pathway, which results in glucaric acid. Also, mercapturic acids, which I just described in gory detail, are indications of the phase 2 conjugation using glutathione and cysteine. So this is a worst case scenario where you see an assault on her liver. The phase 1 is revved up, but phase 2 is in the tank. Okay, this is absolutely the worst case scenario. Clinically, one would intervene with antioxidants for phase 1 and then do everything you can to increase phase 2, probably saunas, and you have other kinds of things in your quiver. But this is a simple first morning urine test to assess phase 1 and phase 2. Now, I want to switch gears and talk about consequences of aberrant methionine metabolism. Glutathione is my favorite tripeptide. My favorite amino acid is metabolism. Told you I was a nerd. And the problem with methionine, disruption of methionine metabolism, is that we get decreased reconversion of methionine from homocysteine. Remember, methionine is methyl homocysteine. We also get decreased methylation, that is from the second product in methionine metabolism, SAM, and that's critical for methylating DNA, RNA, proteins, neurotransmitters, and the conversion of the phospholipid phosphatidylethanolamine to phosphatidylcholine, which is essential for normal membrane function. And then very importantly for detoxification is the transsulfuration arm of methionine metabolism, where we get cysteine, taurine, essential sulfate, not sulfite, but sulfate, and glutathione. And potential clinical consequences include aberrant neurotransmitter metabolism, developmental delay, psychiatric effects, oxidative stress, decreased DNA synthesis and repair, immune dysregulation, even cancer, poor response to environmental toxins, decreased detoxification, and increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, we've all seen this fun cartoon about methionine metabolism. Then we have the conversion of methionine to the methyl donor SAM, going on down to homocysteine, which branches off to transsulfuration on the right, and to remethylation to form methionine on the left. And there's all kinds of things that can go wrong, and Dr. Usman is going to address the specific enzyme issues here and how to deal with those, particularly in combination. But I just want to point out that one of the biggest problems with this pathway is when we get an accumulation of either homocysteine or adenosine that drives this reaction north. It usually goes south, and creates an excess amount of SAL, S-adenosyl homocysteine, which is an incredibly potent inhibitor of all methyltransferase enzymes in the body, including COMT. Okay? So we can have, why do we get accumulated homocysteine? There are several epigenetic phenomena. One would be insufficient nutrients to carry through this process of remethylation of homocysteine. That is inappropriate metabolism of folate, insufficient B12, zinc, B6, and betaine. Also, epigenetically, we know that methionine synthase, the critical step after, everybody looks at MTHFR and says, oh my God, I got a mutation there. You can't do that. You've got all these other enzymes involved. You got to look at all of them together. Particularly, you can have MTR racing away, but if you're inhibiting methionine synthase with mercury or oxidative stress, it's all in vain. You're not getting past this point in the cycle. You're not getting back to produce methionine or SAM. So we have problems there. We also have direct inhibition of methyltransferases by lead and bisphenol A. And then we have a whole host of SNPs. Again, Dr. Usman's going to address these specifically. So we have so many different things that can go wrong with methionine metabolism. How do we know how to fix it when we have both genetic and epigenetic problems going on? Well, a couple of laboratories have come up with a functional phenotypic assay to detect where the bottlenecks in methionine metabolism are. And this is one of my favorite cases. There was a 72-year-old female, severe metabolic syndrome. She had elevated oxidized LDL, small dense LDL, and LP(a), which is antifibrolytic. And those are the key culprits. The regular old LDL doesn't mean anything. These specific 3 LDL cofractions have much more greater clinical specificity with respect to heart disease. So what we see here is she has, her methionine is not real good, and this is a 20 overnight fasted specimen, so we're not looking at an effective diet. She's not getting back and producing a lot of methionine. Her cysteine is low, which potentially compromises her glutathione status, but look at her homocysteine, 23. 23. That drives that reaction north. The increased Sol, which inhibits the methylation reactions, and that the most important thing to look at there is the ratio of methyl donor SAM to the methyl inhibitor Sol, which is in really bad shape. This woman ended up having a triple bypass surgery. And Sol has not only been implicated not just in inhibiting methylation, but it's emerging as an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease because it has much greater clinical specificity than homocysteine. Methylation is also very important for arsenic detoxification, which entails a series of sequential oxidation, reduction, and methylation reactions. Just for the sake of time, we get a monomethylation, then another methylation and reduction, and then finally to dimethyl arsenate, which is conjugated to glutathione and excreted. So the body does this on its own without DMPS, if methylation's working. And this requires, of course, adequate levels of methyl donor SAM and arsenite methyl transferases. Low methionine, folate, and cysteine all impede endogenous arsenic detoxification. So, rapidly, my take-home messages are actually really very straightforward. The hydroxy radical readily damages DNA and is associated with a wide array of chronic diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, mitochondrial dysfunction. The gastrointestinal metabolome, that is, the metabolism of the microbes, impacts innate detoxification in the gut and systemically. Endogenous detoxification processes are inducible and highly energy dependent, and we really need to work on those. Again, the chelators only work in the extracellular space. We need to beef up what the cells are doing. Phases 1 through 3 need to be upregulated in a coordinated manner for optimal detoxification. Normal methionine metabolism, sorry about that. Normal methionine metabolism and methylation transsulfuration is essential for detoxification, and toxic elements can screw up the works at phase 1, phase 2, detoxification, and methionine metabolism. Toxic metals are pro-oxidative and deplete antioxidative enzymes, glutathione and cysteine. Glutathione is absolutely essential for protection against toxic elements, chemicals, oxidative stress, and oxidative damage to DNA. Glutathione can only be upregulated in a sustained manner if you apply the appropriate nutritional support. And selective use of objective laboratory tests, certainly wouldn't run all of these tests on a single patient, can facilitate very efficient patient-specific intervention for environmental toxic and induced illness. And again, I stress that these things, everything I've talked about, should be a component of a metal detoxification protocol. Because if you just throw chelators at people and don't worry about their nutritional status, their wonderful God-given inducible endogenous detox processes, it's just not getting the bang for the buck. And I thank you kindly for your attention and your great intentions. Thank you. We have time for a few questions, or? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you, David. As always, that was great. How do you assess phase 3 detoxification?
Phase 3 would basically be looking at inflammatory markers, any kind of inflammation of the gut or in the liver. And the easiest way to assess inflammation in the gut is with a true comprehensive stool analysis, which several laboratories do. And the primary markers there would be calprotectin, lactoferrin, which are IBD specific, but also lysozyme, which is induced by enteropathogens. So that's how I would look for inflammation in the gut, and that impacts phase 3. I don't know whether other CRP maybe, I don't know what you'd use specifically for the liver, but CRP is general inflammation, so it's hard to say.
Is there any way to test LPS?
There are laboratories that do antibodies for LPS, and the thing there is that the LPS would have to have breached the tight junction proteins between the epithelial cells to become systemically available to form the antibodies. So if you're seeing LPS systemically, you know there's a serious problem in the gut. And there you can look at the serum antigen zonulin, which is the physiological regulator of those tight junction proteins. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question. What is the ideal SAMe to SAW ratio?
Ideal, well above 4. Yes. Dr. Roberts.
You know, the real issue is what are normals. And you guys put these, 95% things and 2.5 on each end. I don't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know what one should have.
Great.
8-hydroxyguanosine, all of them, and especially LP little a. And anyway, that's an issue for all of us because we get this data, and what does it really mean?
Right. Well, there are very specific guidelines that laboratories have to follow to establish reference ranges. And that's dictated by CLIA. And if you don't follow those guidelines, they close your doors. So, you follow their guidelines, and then you use your clinical decision. You say, I don't want to wait till the 95th percentile. I want people to be at the 68th percentile. That's your decision. The laboratories have very specific responsibilities to be able to report you the numbers, but your clinical decision is entirely up to you.
I guess that's what it would be. If we could get some references. I mean, there are people out there that are saying, you know what, like with HSCRP, it used to be greater than 8, no problem, or less than 8. Now, of course, less than 1.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could provide us with some guidance as to people that are doing some more nitty-gritty work on these molecules. Later, I mean, I'm just saying.
If such studies were available, the laboratories would be able to present those studies to the CLIA police and then be able to justify lowering the reference values. But as you know, the academians are not going to approach these kinds of tests in such an aggressive manner. They would rather wait till it becomes, crisis management. And they're not interested and don't really believe in preventive medicine. Even with the CDC is actually the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And yet they're not involved with the prevention part as much as you guys are. Yes.
I'd like to just put out a suggestion when you talk about glutathione S transferase.
Yes, ma'am.
That you put in a recommendation for lithium, because that lithium induces and supports glutathione S transferase, and I find it one of the very depleted minerals in people. And I know that for the genetic evaluations, you get SOD2 marked when it's like, heterozygous or homozygous impaired for manganese, but I've never seen lithium being put out when you look at GSTM snippets that are, heterozygous or others. So, when you read the evaluations that you get from the companies,
right,
they will mention that the patient should have a higher intake of manganese when it comes to SOD2, for example. But I'd suggest the same for the GSTM, GSDP.
Yeah, assess. I agree. I mean, there's more juicy literature coming out about lithium, and as you implied, many people are very, very low in lithium, and we're not talking about lithium carbonate here. I've even seen studies where 20 milligrams of something like lithium aspartate or lithium orotate actually are extremely neuroprotective. And part of that may relate to glutathione because the neurons cannot upregulate glutathione biosynthesis, and they rely on the astrocytes. And so the level of lithium, the protection we see in the neuronal cells in culture may in fact relate to GST. Yeah.
And a question about glutathione. Is that a problem at all if you have like a double SNP with your CBS gene?
If you have a double SNP in your CBS gene, you are going to have very compromised production of glutathione, in which case, well, you could get around that because the CBS is just taking homocysteine on down to cysteine, which becomes, so you could get around that by giving N-acetylcysteine and inducing the rate-limiting amino acid in glutathione biosynthesis. It's not the end of the world. You just have to get around that SNP. Okay. And again, and Dr. Usman's going to emphasize it, just looking at SNPs is one thing, looking at the phenotypic expression of those SNPs, because you could have 40, 50% of normal activity, even with a homozygous. But if you have two CBS SNPs that are in fact documented to be clinically relevant, that's the other problem with SNPs. There are people working away and just looking for SNPs 24/7. It's hard to keep up with the work. The biggest problem is finding out whether a particular SNP is associated with clinical studies that show that it really is significant. So again, I think Dr. Usman's really going to drive that point home, that we can't just look at a SNP. They're very useful for helping us figure out why that phenotypic expression is the way it is, and then it takes less burden off of finding the other epigenetic phenomena. But just looking at SNPs is not terribly productive. Point well taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Quig.